Snow began the story before anything else did. It fell thick and silent, the kind of snow that swallowed sound whole, turning the world into a held breath. It gathered on the crooked fence posts, tucked itself into the hollows of tree roots, and pressed gently against the windows of a small stone cottage crouched at the edge of the woods like it had been there forever. Inside that cottage, a pair of golden eyes snapped open. Morrigan, black as soot, black as ink spilled at midnight, lifted her head from her place on the hearth rug. The fire had burned low while she slept, reduced to a glowing heart of embers, but the warmth still clung to her fur. For a moment she did not move. She listened. The kettle sang softly in its sleep, cooling after a long evening. The clock on the wall ticked with a patient, uneven rhythm. Outside, the wind moved through the bare branches with the sound of pages turning. Something had changed. Morrigan rose, stretching each limb with deliberate care. She was an adult cat, solid and sleek, with a white crescent hidden beneath her chin like a secret moon. Her tail flicked once as she padded toward the window, her paws silent on the old wooden floorboards. She leapt lightly onto the sill and peered out through the frost-laced glass. The world had been rewritten overnight. Snow blanketed the herb garden where dried stalks still stood like fragile skeletons. The path to the woods was gone, swallowed whole. Even the river beyond the trees had vanished, its voice muffled beneath ice and white. The moon hung low and swollen, painting everything silver blue, and for a moment Morrigan felt as though she were standing inside a dream someone else had just finished having. Winter had arrived in earnest. Behind her the cottage shifted, a settling sigh, old beams remembering their weight. Morrigan turned her head as the bedroom door creaked open. Elowen emerged wrapped in a wool shawl, her hair a tumble of dark curls escaping their braid. She blinked sleep from her eyes and smiled when she saw Morrigan silhouetted against the window. "There you are," she murmured, voice thick with warmth. "I thought I dreamed you." Morrigan answered with a soft chirr and hopped down to twine herself around Elowen's ankles. The stone floor was cold this morning, and she could feel it through her paws, but Elowen's presence brought its own heat. Always had. They had found each other years ago. Morrigan had never decided whether she'd been lost or led. But the cottage had been smaller then, the walls barer, the winters lonelier. Now shelves overflowed with books and jars and memories. Now there was tea every morning, bread cooling on the counter, a life built one quiet day at a time. Elowen knelt, pressing her forehead briefly to Morrigan's. "Big day," she whispered, as if the snow itself were listening. Morrigan's ears tipped forward. Big days came rarely in winter. Winter was for tending, for waiting, for listening to the old stories the world told when everything else went quiet. But she trusted Elowen. Elowen knew things. The fire was coaxed back to life. Logs cracked and shifted, sparks snapping like tiny stars. Elowen filled the kettle again and Morrigan resumed her post by the hearth, tail wrapped neatly around her paws. Heat seeped into her bones, slow and comforting. Outside, the sky began to pale. As dawn crept in, Morrigan felt it, the familiar tug at the back of her mind, the one that only came when the world was about to speak. She lifted her head, eyes narrowing, as the cottage filled with the scent of pine resin and fresh bread. Something was coming with the snow, not danger, not exactly joy. A remembering. The wind pressed harder against the walls, carrying with it the echo of bells far off in the forest. Bells that hadn't rung in decades. Bells no one but Morrigan seemed to hear. Her tail flicked again, slow and thoughtful. Winter stories, she knew, always began like this. And they never truly ended. By mid-morning, the snow had not stopped. It thickened instead, flakes growing larger and slower, drifting past the windows like feathers shaken loose from the sky. Morgan watched from her place atop the armchair, chin tucked into her chest, eyes half-lidded but alert. Snow days changed the rhythm of the cottage. Time loosened its grip. Tasks stretched and softened around the warmth of the hearth. Elowen hummed as she worked, a low tune without words, one Morgan had heard in a dozen different shapes over the years. Sometimes it became a lullaby, sometimes a spell. Today it sounded like something meant to be remembered rather than sung. Bread dough rested beneath a linen cloth. Bundles of dried herbs were taken down and examined, then carefully rehung. Elowen moved slowly, as if afraid to startle the day into hurrying. Morgan approved. Winter demanded respect. The bells rang again. This time, Morgan did not pretend she hadn't heard them. Her ears pricked sharply and she rose, balancing easily on the narrow back of the chair. The sound came from the north, deep in the woods, where the trees grew so close together that even moonlight struggled to find the ground. The bells were distant, but their rhythm was steady, patient, waiting. Morgan let out a quiet, questioning trill. Elowen paused. She turned, brow furrowing just slightly. "You hear it too, don't you?" That was new. Morgan hopped down, crossing the room to sit squarely in the center of the floor, tail wrapped tight around her paws. She met Elowen's gaze and held it. The moment stretched, the air between them feeling suddenly charged, like just before a storm. "The bells," Elowen whispered. I thought they were only in the old stories." Morgan's whiskers twitched. Old stories lived everywhere in winter, in the way frost etched lace across the glass, in the way the fire popped when you weren't watching it, in the way the woods leaned closer, listening. Elowen pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders and glanced toward the door. "We should make tea," she said decisively, as though tea could anchor the world back into its proper shape. "And soup." And she smiled, small and fond. "And maybe we don't go anywhere today." Morgan blinked slowly, a cat's version of agreement. Staying in felt right. The bells were not calling them out. They were calling something back. As the kettle came to a boil once more, Morgan returned to the hearth, curling herself into a neat crescent. Heat soaked into her fur, but beneath it ran a different warmth, memory stirring, stretching after a long sleep. She remembered another winter. The cottage had been quieter then, colder. Snow had crept beneath the door, thin fingers searching for warmth. Morgan had been younger, her coat less glossy, her body lean with hunger. She had watched from the trees as the woman, another woman, before Elowen, carried bells into the forest, hanging them high on the branches where the wind could find them. "So we don't forget," the woman had said to no one at all. Morgan had not understood then. She only knew that when the bells rang, the forest listened, and sometimes answered. A ladle clinked softly against the pot, pulling Morgan back to the present. Elowen set a bowl on the table and added a slice of bread beside it. Steam rose, scented with onions and thyme, and something sweeter Morgan could never quite name. Elowen sat, cradling the bowl in both hands. "Funny," she murmured. "I dreamed of her last night." Morgan's eyes opened fully. "She didn't say anything," Elowen continued. "Just stood at the edge of the woods, like she was making sure I remembered the way." The bells rang again, closer now or perhaps louder. Morgan rose and padded to Elowen's side, placing one soft paw on her knee. Elowen looked down and smiled, though her eyes shone with something like nerves. "It's all right," she said, though she might have been saying it to herself. "We're warm, we're together." Outside, snow buried the old paths deeper and deeper, erasing what had been, preparing the ground for what might return. The forest breathed in, slow and deep. Morgan listened, her golden eyes reflecting firelight, bell song, and the quiet certainty that this particular winter, had not come merely to pass the time. It had come to wake something. And it was only just beginning. The afternoon dimmed without ever quite becoming dark. Snowlight has a way of confusing the hours, stretching them thin until morning and evening blur together like wet ink. Morgan watched the shadows shift across the floor, watched the fire rise and fall, watched Eloan move through the cottage with a careful sort of reverence, as though the walls themselves had grown ears. The bells did not ring again for a long while. Instead, there came a hush so deep it felt intentional. Even the wind seemed to step back, holding its breath. Morgan felt it settle over her shoulders like a cloak. She did not dislike it. Silence, after all, was just another way of listening. Eloan finished her soup and set the bowl aside, untouched broth cooling at the bottom. She sat very still at the table, fingers laced together, gaze unfocused. "I used to think winter was empty," she said at last, her voice barely louder than the fire. "Like the world had gone away." Morgan leapt lightly onto the table and crossed to her, placing her weight squarely atop Eloan's folded hands. Eloan laughed softly and shifted, letting her fingers spread beneath Morgan's warm body. "I know better now," Eloan continued. "It's not empty, it's waiting." Morgan purred, a low, steady sound that seemed to stitch the moment together. Waiting was something she understood intimately. Cats were made of waiting, waiting to pounce, waiting to be fed, waiting for the right moment when the world aligned just so. The clock ticked. The fire popped. Somewhere deep in the forest, ice creaked as it tightened its grip on water. Eloan stood and reached for her boots. Morgan stilled. The boots were lined with wool and worn soft with years of use. Eloan only reached for them when something outside could no longer be ignored. Morgan followed her with her eyes, tail flicking once, sharp and uncertain. "I'm not going far," Eloan said, as if responding to a question that hadn't been spoken. "Just to the edge of the trees." Morgan hopped down, landing silently on the floor. She moved to the door and sat, posture unmistakable. Eloan smiled, slow and fond. "Of course," she murmured. "I wouldn't dream of leaving you behind." They bundled themselves against the cold. Eloan in coat and shawl, Morgan in nothing but her thick black fur and the confidence of a creature who belonged to winter more than she feared it. When the door opened, cold air rushed in, sharp and clean, carrying the scent of snow-heavy branches and frozen earth. The world outside felt different now. Snow crunched beneath Eloan's boots as they stepped onto the buried path. Morgan walked ahead, her paws finding firm places where Eloan's feet sank. The forest loomed closer than it had that morning, trees bowing beneath their white burdens, branches knitting together overhead. At the edge of the woods they stopped. The bells hung where they always had, high in the old pine, dulled with age, half hidden by snow. They did not move. No wind stirred them, and yet Morgan could still hear the echo of their song, ringing not in her ears but somewhere deeper. Eloan lifted her lantern, its flame small but steady. "I never took them down," she said quietly. "I thought if I left them, then the stories would have somewhere to stay." Morgan stepped closer to the tree, nose brushing the bark. The pine smelled of sap and frost and time. She remembered climbing it once, long ago, her claws digging deep as she chased something unseen, something laughing. The forest shifted. Not visibly, not dramatically, but Morgan felt it, the subtle turning of attention, like a great many eyes opening all at once. The hush deepened, becoming expectant. Snow fell heavier now, thickening the air between the trees. "Morgan," Eloin whispered. The cat turned, her golden eyes bright in the lantern light. She felt it too, the tug stronger now, a thread pulling gently at her chest. Memory pressed close, warm and insistent. There were paths beneath the snow. There always were. Old ones, walked thin by stories and footsteps and promises made long before Eloin was born. Winter did not erase them. Winter preserved them. The bells trembled. Just once. Eloin sucked in a breath, sharp and unsteady. "That's not the wind," she said. Morgan took a step forward, then another, tail raised high. She knew this moment, had known it would come since the first snow fell against the cottage window. Behind them, the lantern flickered but did not go out. Ahead of them, between the trees, something shifted. No shape yet, no sound, only the sense of being very close to remembering something important. Morgan paused, glancing back at Eloin as if to say, "Come only if you're ready." The forest waited, and the winter held its breath. Eloin did not move at first. Her breath fogged the air in front of her face, rising and dissolving like something half-thought. The lantern's flame trembled, responding not to wind but to the subtle shift in the world's attention. Snow continued to fall, thick and quiet, softening every edge. Morgan stood with one paw lifted, poised between now and then. At last, Eloin nodded, small, resolute, and took a single step forward. The forest answered with a sound like a deep exhale. Not a voice, not quite, but an acknowledgement, the kind given to those who remembered how to listen. The bells did not ring again, but they no longer needed to. The path revealed itself not by appearing, but by being felt. Morgan led, her paws finding places of certainty beneath the snow, each step guided by a memory older than her bones. Eloin followed carefully, trusting where Morgan stepped, where the hush seemed to open just enough to let them through. The trees closed in. Branches arched overhead, heavy with white, forming a tunnel of frost and shadow. Lantern light danced across bark etched with age, illuminating knots that looked like eyes and roots that twisted like sleeping hands. Morgan's whiskers brushed against low-hanging needles, scattering tiny avalanches of snow that dusted her back. She did not shake them off. Winter's weight was part of the language. As they walked, Morgan felt the pull strengthen, not urgent, not demanding, but steady, like the tide, like gravity, like something long patient finally sensing its moment. She remembered other winters, layered atop one another like quilts. She remembered curling beside the hearth when the bells first came down from the rafters, still bright and new. She remembered paws that were not hers moving silently beside her in the woods, shadows with eyes like starlight. She remembered being chosen, not in a single moment, but slowly, again and again. Eloin stumbled just once, boot catching on something hidden beneath the snow. Morgan stopped immediately, turning back with a sharp chirr. Eloin laughed softly, breathless. "I'm all right," she said. "Just, it feels like walking into a dream." Morgan returned to her side, brushing against Eloin's leg, grounding her. Dreams could be walked through if you knew how, if you paid attention. The forest opened into a small clearing. Snow lay undisturbed here, smooth as porcelain, reflecting the lantern light back in soft halos. At the center stood a stone, low and wide, its surface carved with shallow grooves filled with ice. The markings were old, worn thin by time, but Morgan knew them the way one knows the shape of one's own name. Eloin stopped short, awe softening her face. "Oh," she breathed, "I thought this was only a story." Stories were never only stories. Morgan approached the stone, placing her paws against its cold surface. The chill seeped into her pads, sharp but not unpleasant. Beneath the ice something stirred. Not awake, not asleep. Waiting. The air grew heavier, thick with pine and frost and something else. Something like the smell of old books and candle smoke and wool left too long by the fire. Aloan set the lantern down at the edge of the clearing. Its light spread outward, careful not to intrude too far, as if it, too, understood boundaries. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do," Aloan whispered. Morrigan looked back at her. Golden eyes met human ones, and in that moment the years folded in on themselves. Aloan saw not clearly, not fully, but enough. A black shape moving through seasons. Bells ringing and falling silent. Hands, many hands, tending fires, hanging herbs, telling the same stories with different voices. "You're already doing it," Aloan said, realization soft and trembling in her voice. Morrigan sat, tail curled neatly around her paws. The stone hummed just barely, a vibration felt more than heard. Snowflakes slowed as they fell, drifting lazily, as if reluctant to disturb the moment. From the far side of the clearing, something shifted again. A shadow detached itself from the trees, not dark, not light, but made of both. It did not approach. It did not retreat. It simply was, patient as winter itself. Morrigan's ears tipped forward, her body alert but calm. She had known this meeting would come too, had known it would not be rushed. Aloan's breath caught. She did not step back. The forest leaned closer. And the story, warm and ancient, opened another page. The shadow did not move closer, yet it felt nearer with every heartbeat. It had no single shape, edges softened by drifting snow, form suggested rather than declared. It was the color of moonlit bark and starless sky, of ink diluted in water. Morrigan watched it with steady eyes, her body loose but ready, the way she always was when standing at the threshold of something old. Aloan's hand hovered at her side, fingers twitching with the instinct to reach for Morrigan's fur, to ground herself in something warm and solid. She did not touch. Some moments asked to be witnessed without interruption. The stone hummed again, stronger this time. Ice within its carvings cracked softly, thin lines spidering outward. The sound echoed through the clearing like the slow stretching of joints after a long sleep. Morrigan remembered the last time she had stood here. The clearing had been darker then, the snow thinner, the air sharp with grief. Bells had rung until the forest itself seemed to ache with them. A woman, older than Aloan, younger than the stories, had knelt at the stone and pressed her forehead to its surface, tears freezing where they fell. "Keep her safe," the woman had whispered. Morrigan had not understood the words, but she had understood the promise beneath them. She always did. The shadow shifted, resolving slightly as though leaning forward in interest. When it spoke, if speaking was the right word, it did so without sound. The meaning pressed gently into the space behind Morrigan's eyes, warm and familiar. "You have kept the watch well." Morrigan's tail flicked once, slow and deliberate. Praise was not something she sought, but acknowledgement mattered, especially from those who remembered. Aloan swallowed. "I feel like I should say something," she whispered, though no one had asked her to. The shadow turned its attention to her. Aloan stiffened, but she did not flee. Lantern light painted her in gold and amber, softening the worry lines at the corners of her eyes. Snow clung to the hem of her coat, to the curls escaping her braid. "You already have," the presence seemed to say, "every day." Aloan's breath shuddered. She pressed a hand to her chest. "I didn't know," she said. "I swear I didn't know what I was stepping into when I came to the cottage." Morrigan glanced back at her, whiskers forward. Aloan met her gaze and smiled faintly, wet-eyed. But I stayed, Eloin continued. I kept the fire lit. I fed the cat. I listened to the stories even when they frightened me. The stone's hum deepened, resonating through the ground. Snow slid from the branches overhead in soft cascades. The shadow drew nearer, not forward but into the clearing like a thought fully formed. Morrigan felt the cold intensify, not biting but clarifying. The world sharpened. That is how it begins, the presence replied. That is how it always begins. Morrigan stood and walked a slow circle around the stone, her steps precise. With each turn, memory layered itself over the present. Morrigan saw other keepers standing where Eloin stood now, some laughing, some trembling, some fierce with determination. She had watched them all. She had stayed when others left. She had learned when to guide and when to simply sit and purr. Eloin knelt, unprompted, pressing her palm to the snow. The cold bit through her glove, grounding her. "I don't know what comes next," she admitted. Morrigan stopped beside her, her black fur a stark contrast against the white. She leaned into Eloin's knee, steady and warm. "Neither did the others," the presence answered. "That is not required." From somewhere deep in the forest came the faintest echo of bells, not ringing, not yet, but remembered. The sound threaded itself through the clearing, twinning with the hum of the stone, with the steady rhythm of Morrigan's purr. Eloin laughed softly through her tears. "I always wondered why she left the bells up," she said. "Why she didn't take them down when she left." The shadow's attention softened. So the forest would know it was not forgotten. Morrigan lifted her head, eyes reflecting lantern light and starlight both. The snow thickened again, falling faster now, as if the sky itself were eager to cover its tracks. Something beneath the stone stirred more noticeably, not rising, not waking fully, but shifting, stretching, preparing. The winter pressed close, deep and patient. And Morrigan, keeper of thresholds and hearths and quiet promises, settled herself beside the stone, ready to listen to whatever came next. Snow gathered faster now, not wild or violent but purposeful, layering the clearing in a fresh, unbroken skin. The lantern's glow softened as flakes passed through it, each one briefly lit before vanishing into white. Eloin remained kneeling, her hands still pressed to the ground, as though she could feel the slow turning of something beneath the earth. Morrigan sat beside the stone, spine straight, ears forward, her body a quiet declaration. "I am here. I have always been here." The presence, no longer merely a shadow, yet not fully a form, seemed to breathe with the forest. With each breath, the clearing felt older, deeper, as if time itself were loosening its hold. "The bells have waited," it conveyed. "So has the stone, so have you." Eloin closed her eyes. "I never meant to take her place," she whispered. "I just lived." Morrigan's purr deepened, vibrating through the frozen ground. "Living is the work," came the reply, "the tending, the staying." A breeze stirred at last, gentle but deliberate. Snow lifted from the surface of the stone, revealing more of the carvings beneath, lines and spirals that curved into one another, marks made by hands that had known both sorrow and hope. The ice within the grooves melted, then refroze, clearer than before. Morrigan stepped forward and placed one paw into a spiral's center. The world shifted, not abruptly, not painfully, but unmistakably. The clearing seemed to stretch, widening just enough to hold more than it had moments before. Morrigan felt it in her bones, the way one feels a door open behind them without turning to look. Memories stirred again, not her own this time, but Eloin's, threaded through Morrigan like warmth passing from one body to another. Eloin gasped softly. She saw herself arriving at the cottage for the first time, exhausted, uncertain, the key cold in her hand. She saw the empty hearth, the dust, the quiet that had felt less like peace and more like abandonment. She saw Morgan sitting in the doorway, small then, watching with eyes too knowing for a stray. "I thought she chose me," Aloan whispered. Morgan glanced back, tail flicking. "You chose each other," the presence corrected gently. The forest leaned closer still. Branches creaked. Snow slid. Somewhere far away an owl called once, then fell silent. From beneath the stone came a low, resonant sound, like a bell struck underwater. The ground thrummed faintly, sending a shiver through Morgan's whiskers and up Aloan's spine. Aloan pressed her other hand to the stone now, ungloved, skin meeting cold. She winced but did not pull away. "What is it?" she asked. "What's waking up?" Morgan withdrew her paw and sat again, eyes fixed on the stone. "Not waking," the presence replied, turning. Snow fell thicker, blurring the edges of the clearing. The lantern guttered but held. Morgan felt the familiar tightening in her chest, the knowledge that the world was shifting into a new arrangement, one that would demand patience and care. She had done this before. She would do it again. Aloan's breath steadied as understanding began to settle, not complete, not comfortable, but enough. "Winter isn't an ending," she said slowly. "It's a keeping." The present seemed to smile, though it had no mouth. "Yes." The bells echoed faintly once more, not from the trees this time, but from everywhere at once, from the snow, the stone, the quiet space between heartbeats. Morgan lowered herself fully to the ground, curling her tail around her body, anchoring the moment. The forest listened. The cottage waited. And the winter, deep and deliberate, continued to unfold its long, patient story. The sound beneath the stone faded, not gone but absorbed, like warmth sinking deeper into coals rather than flaring into flame. Snow continued to fall, yet the clearing no longer felt exposed. It felt held. Aloan drew her hand back at last, fingers reddened from the cold. She tucked them into her sleeves and let out a breath that shook its way through her chest. Morgan rose and stepped closer, placing her full weight against Aloan's shin. The contact was firm, grounding, real in a way that thoughts were not. "Thank you," Aloan murmured, "not to anyone in particular." Morgan tilted her head slightly. Gratitude was a language she understood well. The presence did not recede, but it softened, like fog thinning in the morning sun. The forest relaxed around them, branches settling, snow slipping from needles in quiet cascades. The clearing seemed smaller again, more ordinary, just trees and snow and stone. But the ordinary now carried depth, the way a familiar room changes once you learn its history. "It is time to return," the presence conveyed, neither urging nor dismissing. "What stirs does not need watching tonight." Aloan nodded slowly, as if she'd been expecting that answer. "We shouldn't stay," she said, half to Morgan, half to herself. "Not yet." Morgan glanced once more at the stone, committing its new stillness to memory. Then she turned and began to walk back the way they had come, confident that the path would hold. Aloan followed, lifting the lantern, its light once again carving a gentle tunnel through the trees. As they left the clearing, snow fell more freely, already softening their footprints. The forest closed behind them without a sound. The walk back felt shorter, though the snow was deeper. Morgan's paws remembered each turn, each root hidden beneath white. Aloan trusted that memory implicitly now, stepping where Morgan stepped, breathing easier with every pace. "I used to be afraid of quiet," Aloan said after a while. "I thought it meant something was wrong." Morgan flicked an ear, listening. "But it doesn't," Aloan continued. "It means something's listening." Morgan gave a low, approving chirr. When the cottage finally came into view, its windows glowing amber against the blue-white dusk, Eloan felt her shoulders drop, tension unspooling as warmth beckoned them home. Snow had piled high against the door while they were gone, and Eloan laughed softly as she shouldered it open. Inside, the air smelled of ash and herbs and bread long cooled. The fire had burned low again, but it greeted them with a familiar crackle as Eloan coaxed it back to life. Morrigan shook snow from her paws and leapt up onto the hearth rug, curling immediately into her favorite spot as if she had never left. Eloan removed her boots and coat, moving slower now, the weight of what she'd felt settling gently rather than heavily. She set the lantern down, poured fresh water into the kettle, and stood for a long moment simply listening to the cottage breathe. The bells did not ring. Instead, there was only the quiet tick of the clock, the whisper of fire, the steady certainty of walls that had stood through many winters and would stand through many more. Eloan knelt beside Morrigan and brushed snow crystals from her fur. "You knew," she said softly. "All this time you knew." Morrigan opened one golden eye, then the other, and stretched languidly, toes splaying in the warmth. She offered no denial. Some truths did not require explanation. Outside, snow continued to fall, thick and deliberate, burying the world into stillness. Somewhere beneath it all, something turned again, slow and patient. And inside the cottage, wrapped in firelight and quiet understanding, the night settled in deep, watchful, and far from finished. Night did not arrive all at once. It seeped in gently, like ink spreading through water, darkening the corners first. The windows became mirrors, reflecting firelight and shadow, Morrigan's sleek shape curled by the hearth, Eloan's silhouette moving slowly through familiar motions. Snow continued its patient work outside, softening the world until even the idea of sharpness felt distant. Eloan set the kettle on, and did not light it right away. She leaned against the counter instead, palms resting on the worn wood, and simply breathed. The cottage seemed to breathe back, timbers creaking softly, the chimney sighing as warm air rose. Morrigan felt the shift in the room, the way the day was folding itself neatly away. This was the hour Morrigan loved most. Not quite sleeping, not quite waking, the hour when stories slipped their leashes. Eloan finally struck the match and lit the stove. Flame bloomed, small and steady. She filled a mug with dried apple slices and chamomile, then hesitated before adding something else, a pinch of rosemary, fingers trembling just slightly. "For remembering," she murmured. Morrigan's tail tip twitched in approval. When Eloan sat on the floor beside the hearth, mug cradled in both hands, Morrigan lifted her head. Eloan did not reach for her this time. She waited. Morrigan rose, stretched with luxurious slowness, and crossed the small distance to settle against Eloan's thigh, her weight warm and deliberate. Eloan smiled down at her. "You always know when to sit close." Morrigan purred, deep and rhythmic, the sound threading itself into the crackle of the fire. Her eyes drifted half-closed, but her awareness remained sharp, tuned to the subtle movements beneath the surface of the night. Outside, the wind returned, not harsh, not cold, but curious. It pressed gently against the windows, rattled the shutters once, then moved on. Snow shifted on the roof with a soft, sliding sigh. Eloan sipped her tea. "When I was little," she said quietly, "I used to think winter was the loneliest season, everything gone, everything asleep." Morrigan remembered Eloan as a child, not clearly, not the way humans remembered, but in impressions. A small, careful presence, someone who listened more than she spoke. "But now," Eloan continued, "I think it's the season that keeps secrets safest." Morrigan opened one eye and regarded her. Secrets were like seeds. They needed cold, time, stillness. The fire popped suddenly, sending a brief spray of sparks upward. Morgan did not flinch. She had watched thousands of fires live and die. Each one had its own temperament, its own voice. The clock chimed, slow and uneven, marking an hour that felt less like time passing and more like time settling into place. Elowen leaned her head back against the armchair and closed her eyes. "I don't feel afraid anymore," she said, surprised. "I thought I would." Morgan shifted slightly, pressing closer. Fear was useful sometimes, but it was not always necessary. Beyond the cottage walls, deep beneath the snow, the forest shifted again. Roots creaked as they adjusted. Ice tightened and loosened in slow cycles. Something old, neither hurried nor hesitant, continued its quiet turning. Morgan felt it like a distant tide, steady and inevitable. Her pulse softened, slowing, matching the rhythm of Elowen's breathing. The night stretched long before them, full of listening and tending and small, meaningful silences. Winter had many hours yet to unfold. And Morgan, keeper of hearths and half-forgotten paths, remained exactly where she was meant to be. Sleep did not come quickly. It hovered instead, drifting near the edges of the room like a shy guest unsure of its welcome. Elowen remained on the floor, back against the chair, tea cooling forgotten in her hands. Morgan stayed pressed to her side, a dark, steady warmth, her breathing slow and even. The fire burned lower, its voice changing from crackle to murmur. This was the hour when the cottage remembered itself. The beams overhead creaked softly, settling into the cold. Shadows shifted along the walls, stretching and thinning as the flames moved. The shelves seemed to lean inward, jars of dried herbs whispering faintly as if comparing notes. Morgan's ears flicked at those sounds, not alarmed, just attentive. Old houses spoke when the night grew deep enough. Elowen opened her eyes and stared into the fire. "I think," she said slowly, choosing each word with care, "that I've been preparing for this without knowing it." Morgan's purr deepened, encouraging. "All the little things," Elowen went on, "keeping the paths clear, leaving food out in the worst weather, talking to the house even when I felt silly." She smiled faintly. "Talking to you." Morgan lifted her head at that, golden eyes reflecting flame. She gave a soft, questioning chirr. Elowen laughed under her breath. "You always listened." Listening, Morgan knew, was an act of devotion. Outside, the snow slowed. The world beyond the windows grew dimmer, quieter, as if wrapped in layers of wool. Moonlight filtered through the clouds in pale bands, painting the drifts with soft silver. Morgan felt the subtle pull again, not urgent but persistent. The turning beneath the forest continued, measured and deliberate. Tonight was not for action. Tonight was for settling. She rose and crossed the room, leaping lightly onto the windowsill. Cold pressed through the glass beneath her paws. She gazed out into the white dark woods, tail wrapped neatly around her body. Elowen watched her. "Do you see something?" Morgan did not turn. Some things were meant to be seen alone. Beyond the trees, beneath snow and root and frozen soil, the paths were knitting themselves back together. Threads of memory tightening, names being remembered, not spoken yet, but held. The bells did not ring. They waited. Morgan jumped down and returned to Elowen, brushing her leg with deliberate affection before settling once more by the hearth. Elowen shifted, stretching stiff limbs, and carefully stood. She banked the fire, arranging the logs just so, murmuring thanks under her breath. Then she paused, hand resting on the mantel. "Tomorrow," she said softly, "not as a plan but as an offering. Tomorrow we'll check the stores, I'll bake again. I'll make sure everything's ready." Ready for what, she did not say. Morgan curled tighter, tucking her nose beneath her tail. The fire's glow painted her black fur with copper highlights. Her eyes slipped closed, though her awareness did not fade completely. Winter nights were long. They held space for remembering, for becoming, for things that moved slowly and carefully through time. Morgan listened to the cottage, to Aloan's footsteps as she climbed the stairs, to the soft click of the bedroom door. The house settled fully now. Outside, snow continued to fall, quiet, patient, deliberate, layer by layer, keeping the world safe while it changed. And beneath it all, unseen but undeniable, the story continued to gather itself, waiting for the next moment when someone would listen closely enough to hear it breathe. The night deepened, thick as wool. Morgan drifted in that familiar state between sleep and watchfulness, where dreams brushed against memory and neither quite claimed her. The fire sank into embers, glowing like a hidden heart. Above, the cottage breathed, slow, steady, alive in the way old things were alive. Snow whispered against the windows. Morgan dreamed, but not in pictures. She dreamed in warmth, of hands cupping a mug, of bread rising beneath a cloth, of bells hanging silent but ready. She dreamed of winters stacked atop one another like rings inside a tree, each one distinct, each one remembered. She dreamed of Aloan, of her laughter echoing through rooms that once stood empty, of her careful way of learning the cottage's moods, of the quiet courage it took to stay when leaving would have been easier. Somewhere in the dark, a floorboard creaked. Morgan's eyes opened instantly. She lifted her head, ears pricked, body still. The sound was not alarming. It was the gentle complaint of wood adjusting to cold. Still, she listened, counting heartbeats. Nothing followed. Satisfied, she rose and padded softly toward the stairs. Aloan had gone to bed, but Morgan knew better than to assume sleep came easily tonight. She paused at the bottom step, tail flicking once, then began to climb, careful and silent. At the top, moonlight spilled across the landing. The bedroom door stood ajar. Aloan lay beneath a quilt stitched with small, uneven stars, eyes open, staring at the ceiling. She turned her head as Morgan entered, relief softening her features. "I was hoping you'd come," she whispered. Morgan leapt lightly onto the bed and circled twice before settling against Aloan's chest, warm and solid. Aloan's arm came around her automatically, fingers sinking into soft fur. They lay like that, listening to the night. "I keep thinking I hear something," Aloan murmured. "Not bells, just movement, like the world adjusting itself." Morgan purred, slow and deep. That was exactly what it was. Outside, the forest shifted again, not dramatically, not loudly. Branches eased under snow's weight. Ice cracked and healed. Roots pressed deeper into earth. The turning continued, unseen and unhurried. Aloan's breathing gradually slowed. Morgan felt it beneath her, the steady rhythm anchoring her to the present. She closed her eyes once more, allowing herself to rest fully now. Dreams returned, gentler this time. She dreamed of paws beside hers on old paths, of lantern lights swinging through trees, of bells rung by hands long gone and hands yet to come. She dreamed of the stone, quiet now but not silent, holding warmth deep within. Toward morning, the snow finally began to ease. The sky lightened imperceptibly, from black to deep blue, from blue to gray. Morgan stirred, stretching one paw, claws flexing gently against the quilt. Aloan shifted but did not wake. Dawn would come soon. With it would come tending and watching and small, careful choices that mattered more than they seemed. Morgan remained where she was, keeper of warmth and thresholds, listening as winter prepared to speak again. Morning arrived quietly, as if not to disturb what the night had carefully arranged. Light crept through the curtains in pale, diluted bands, turning the quilt a soft gray-blue and tracing the gentle rise and fall of Eloan's breathing. Morgan lay still atop her, awake long before the day, listening to the subtle sounds that marked the world's return to motion. The house ticked and sighed. Somewhere in the walls, water shifted in its pipes. Outside, snow slipped from branches in muffled thumps, each one sounding like the closing of a book. Morgan lifted her head and sniffed the air. The scent of winter had changed. Not ended, winter was far from finished, but adjusted, sharpened. The snow carried less urgency now, more intention. The night's work had been done. Whatever had turned beneath the forest had settled into its new alignment like a key finding the right groove. Eloan stirred beneath her. She murmured, eyes still closed. Her hand tightened briefly in Morgan's fur, then relaxed. You're warm. Morgan purred, indulgent. Eloan blinked awake slowly, the way people did when they had slept deeply but dreamed heavily. She stared for a moment, orienting herself, then smiled as memory returned. Oh, she said softly, you're still here. Morgan's tail flicked once in mild offense. She had never gone anywhere. Eloan laughed quietly and shifted, careful not to dislodge her. I don't feel strange, she said, more to herself than to Morgan. I thought I might, after everything last night. Morgan studied her face. The tension that usually lived between Eloan's brows was gone. In its place was something steadier, an ease that came not from answers, but from belonging to the question. Eloan sat up slowly, cradling Morgan against her chest for a moment before setting her gently on the bed. Cold air rushed in as Eloan pulled on her robe and crossed to the window. She drew the curtain back. The world beyond the glass was blanketed in white, smooth and luminous beneath the morning sky. The trees stood heavy and patient, branches bowed but unbroken. Smoke rose from the cottage chimney in a thin, faithful line. The path was gone again, buried completely, as if it had never been there at all. Eloan smiled at that. Well, she said, turning back toward the room, I suppose we'll make a new one. Morgan leapt down from the bed and padded after her as they descended the stairs together. The cottage greeted them with warmth and quiet competence. The fire still held embers. The kettle waited where it had been left. Nothing felt disturbed, only ready. Eloan moved through the kitchen with a calm, purposeful grace. She stoked the fire, filled the kettle, set dough to rise. Each motion seemed to fit her more closely now, as though the cottage had finally finished measuring her and found her acceptable. Morgan resumed her post by the hearth, tail wrapped neatly around her paws. She watched Eloan from half-lidded eyes, listening to the cadence of the morning settle into place. Outside, the forest stood hushed beneath snow, its secrets held tight and safe. Inside, the day began, slow, careful, and attentive. Winter had many pages yet to turn. And Morgan, black as midnight and warm as home, remained at the heart of it all, waiting to see what the next one would bring. The winter did not announce its ending. It loosened instead. Days lengthened by minutes so small they were almost imaginary. The sun learned how to linger on the edge of the trees again, slipping honey-colored light across the snow just long enough to remind the world what warmth felt like. Icicles dripped in slow, patient rhythms. The forest exhaled carefully, as though afraid to undo what had been so deliberately set in place. Morgan noticed first, of course. She noticed the way the snow no longer swallowed sound quite so completely. The way birds returned in tentative pairs, voices soft and experimental. The way the stone beneath the clearing's snow no longer hummed, but rested, content settled like something that had found its proper name again. Eloin noticed too, in her own way. She noticed how her hands moved without hesitation now, how she knew exactly how much wood to bring in, how long to leave bread to rise, when to leave the forest alone and when to greet it at the edge. She noticed how the cottage responded to her, no longer testing, no longer waiting but accepting. Winter remained, but it had softened its grip. One afternoon, near the season's quiet turning point, Eloin bundled herself once more and stepped outside with Morrigan padding at her heels. Snow still covered the ground, but it bore the faint, granular texture of something preparing to change. The sky was pale and wide, clouds moving with unhurried purpose. They did not go far. Just to the place where the forest began, where the trees thinned enough to let light filter through. Eloin stopped there and set down a small bundle, bread, a bit of dried apple, a ribbon faded from age. "For the keeping," she said simply. Morrigan sat beside her, tail flicking once. The forest did not speak. It did not need to. A breeze moved through the branches, gentle and approving. Somewhere deep within, bells stirred, not ringing, not yet, but alive with the possibility of sound. Eloin rose and brushed snow from her knees. She rested her hand briefly on Morrigan's head, fingers warm against dark fur. "Thank you," she said. Morrigan looked up at her, golden eyes bright and steady. There are moments when a story closes itself, not with finality but with understanding. This was one of them. They returned to the cottage as the sun dipped low, painting the snow in soft rose and gold. Smoke rose from the chimney, steady as a promise. Inside, the fire waited, patient and faithful. Morrigan curled once more on the hearth rug, the place that had always been hers. Eloin settled nearby, book unopened in her lap, content simply to exist within the quiet. Outside, winter gathered itself, not to depart entirely but to rest. Inside, warmth held. And Morrigan, black cat keeper, witness constant, closed her eyes at last, knowing the story had found its proper pause. Not an ending exactly, but a home,